Welcome friends to another r/prorevenge video. If you like hearing really good stories of comeuppance, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons down below. That said, our first story of comeuppance is by 327 Nova. My cousin stole loads of jewelry, so I stole his inheritance. 25 years ago, my aunt passed away when I was a baby, leaving my two cousins, who were both in their early 20s, alone to fend for themselves. My grandparents, who were very wealthy, put a clause in their will that grandkids will receive half of their share of the inheritance if a parent passes before the child reaches age 30, and then the other half when my grandparents eventually passed. Both my cousins received a very sizable inheritance, coupled with the money they got from selling my aunt's house. The younger of the two paid off her college loans and was able to buy property. She still lives on the same plot of land. The older sibling blew all of his money. Straight out of a book of the Bible, within 6 years, he was back to living in a condo, working as a police officer. Everyone in our small family knew he had a substance issue, so he was barely making ends meet with his officer's salary and buying copious amounts of drugs. The next 4 years, my cousin went to rehab 3 times, sponsored by my grandparents. He sobered up after getting his girlfriend, now wife, pregnant. Absolutely wretched woman. She saw my grandparents as payday and essentially baby-trapped my cousin, thinking it was her ticket. Within 7 years, they had 3 kids, so she's locked in tight. She's a nurse, and with 3 kids around, they always needed a little boost. Guess who they would always ask? You got it, my grandparents. Being the kind spirits they are, they always lended a hand. My father, mother, sister, and I got sick of it very quickly. My grandmother unfortunately passed away when I was 17, leaving my grandpa as the last remaining. I was undoubtedly my grandfather's favorite among the grandkids, which left a real sore spot in the mouth of my cousin and his wife. I had 2 more years at home before college, so I lived with my grandpa to keep him company and to help take care of him. My cousin and his wife hated this, so much so that whenever they came to visit and I wasn't home, they would send their 3 gremlins into my room to destroy it. My room had double doors, so it couldn't be locked. This was the start. The longer I lived there, the more they would mess with me. My cousin even went as far as to place one of those little mechanical noisemakers in the cabinet in my room, the ones that play sounds at random intervals that make you think you're insane. Thankfully, my German Shepherd would always hear it, and after a week or so, she finally found it. They did this to distance me and deter me from taking care of Grandpa so they could swoop in and be the heroes. This continued until one of the kids found my gun. By this time, I was 18 and in the possession of a firearm. I use quotations because my grandfather has guns but cannot aim or shoot them anymore due to arthritis and nerve degeneration. So when I moved in, he placed all the weapons in my hands should the need of self-defense arise. But should he see them out for any reason other than a cleaning, there would be heck to raise. Being very well trained with guns and having a sense of pride in defending my home, I took this responsibility very seriously. I always kept a handgun in a locked container in my nightstand with the key on a high shelf out of reach from the gremlins. One fateful day, I'm out getting my grandfather food when I come home, and my older cousin, his wife, and my grandfather are staring at a gun on the table. It was my gun that I kept in the lockbox. It was loaded and had a bullet chambered. I always keep a magazine in the lockbox but never loaded it into the gun. The lockbox was nowhere to be seen. My cousin claimed one of the children found the gun and was playing with it. I was 100% certain that he either found the key or broke the lockbox open to get to it and load it, as a 6-year-old would not be able to reach a key I could barely grab, figure out what it was to, load my gun, and chamber it. I tried my best to explain what my cousin had said was BS and that I never keep my firearms loaded in the house. But my cousin, who's a cop, scolded me on gun safety and threatened to have me arrested if I didn't leave, and hadn't arrested me yet because we're family. I was asked to collect my belongings and go back to my parents. My cousin had won, or so he thought. The next day, I apologized to Grandpa and explained to him there was no way one of the kids could have gotten the key. He agreed with me and apologized, but he thought it was best I move out until things cooled down. But once they do, I would be welcome back home. Our relationship was a little fractured due to the disinformation provided by my cousin. A month later, my grandfather died of a heart attack at 86. I was devastated. I was just beginning to get back into rhythm with him and rebuilding the trust that was somewhat shattered. To this day, I'm still unsure what kind of man he saw me as due to my cousin. Immediately, my cousin and his wife began sucking up to my dad as they had sealed payday with Grandpa. It was time to move on to the uncle. This persisted for a month or two. I wouldn't stand for it. Then it came time for the will. My grandfather's lawyer read out the will to me, my father, mother, and sister in our home. Our two cousins would be briefed individually on their share of the estate, per my grandparents' requests. Then the miracle line in the will comes to fruition. If anyone attempts to claim any part of the estate that is not assigned to them, they forfeit any assets that they're supposed to receive and will be divided equally among the remaining family members. This was basically their way of saying, if you try to claim more than you're given, you get nothing. My father's supposed to receive every piece of physical property, aside from 2 or 3 items he set aside for me, from my grandparents, as he's the only remaining child. The revenge. I hatched my plan. I called my cousin and told him all of Grandma's jewelry was to be donated to a charity auction. Grandma's collection of gems and medals was extensive to say the least, so a charity event wouldn't care if a few pieces didn't make it, right? It was a lure of gargantuan proportions that my greedy jerk of a cousin could not resist. He bit right on it and headed over to my grandparents' house ASAP, determined to snatch up as much as he could. A handful would send his kids to college. Regardless of what I said, the jewelry was never going to go to him anyways, so his actions were purely his own since none of it was destined to be his. Coincidentally, Dad was on his way with the lawyer to my grandparents' house to overlook everything, formality stuff. According to my dad's testimony, my cousin had 3 shoeboxes worth of Grandma and Grandpa's jewelry piled on the kitchen counter ready for loading into his car. My dad and the lawyer stood in the kitchen wondering why it was all there when my cousin walks in from my grandparents' bedroom with a 4th and final shoebox. The jig was up and he put 2 and 2 together that I set him up, which was true. But there was no penalty against me for exploiting my cousin's greed, so he would mess himself over. It's worth noting that between the 18 years from my aunt's death and my grandparents' death, their wealth had increased several times over, so my cousin felt cheated and expected to receive just as much as my sister and I, despite receiving half of his already and blowing through it. Throughout this whole ordeal, his younger sister, my other cousin, has not had a problem at all, and is still weeping over Grandpa's death like the rest of us. However, just like that, my cousin lost enough money in the course of 30 minutes that made him contemplate his sanity over greed. My cousin's witch of a wife apparently filed for a divorce a few weeks later. We haven't heard from him in nearly 6 years, as he's all but disgraced now. You can call this a fairy tale ending, and on this particular part of the story, it somewhat is. There was a massive lawsuit by an unknown family member involving the IRS and FBI later on, but honestly, I would rather have my grandparents. Let me ask you guys, if there was a relative of yours passing on an inheritance, and there was something you could probably do to get more of that inheritance instead of it going to other parts of your family, would you go about trying to do it? Let me know in the comments down below. Our next story is by King Arthur 20. My boss didn't believe I was sick. So years ago, I worked in electoral retail sales. I specialized in kitchen items, ovens, dishwashers, etc. So I called in sick one week as I was firing out both ends. No, this was my first time calling in sick. Plus, I always worked days off when I was called in. I was young at the time and the commission was good. So I had just done 3 months straight working and had a few days off sick. I went to the doctor's the first day and was given a sick note for 7 days. I returned to work 5 days after becoming sick, 2 days less than the sick note allowed, and was immediately called into my boss's office, so I sat down and saw a colleague was present as a witness. As soon as I sat down, I was immediately yelled at and accused of faking a sickness. I found out later that the rumor was started that I was job hunting. After about 30 minutes of being yelled at and called a liar, etc., he finally stopped and asked if I had anything to say for myself. I was pretty shaken and upset by this point, so I pulled out my doctor's note and slammed it on his desk, and specifically pointed out that I had 2 days left for sick leave. I told him I quit and that I'll be reporting this meeting to HR and walked out. I spent the next 2 days relaxing at home, ignoring his 10+ calls. I did return to work after the 2 days and again was immediately called into the boss's office. Again with the same witness, this time he was extremely apologetic, asking me to not escalate the incident. I flat out told him, "Freak you, you arrogant runt." If you ever question me again, I'll let HR know about our meeting. The funny thing is that he ended up being the best boss I ever worked for, and I learned so much from him. Maybe the reason they were the best boss ever is because maybe this opened their eyes as to how to treat people underneath them. Hopefully it just in general made this boss a better boss because, hey, they don't want to get raked over the coals saying, "You weren't really sick, you liar." It's at least good to hear that somebody can rebound from something as awful as that. This next story is by Ramradron. Push in front of me in the checkout line, suffer the stank. This happened in 1989 in Chicago. I was at a grocery store and had just a handful of items. I entered the checkout line, and before I could put my purchases on the conveyor belt, I was hit with the stench of poop, rotten eggs, and fermented urine. Ahead of me was a homeless man purchasing a 40-ounce beer, swaying as he was counting out his coins. I stepped back several feet, which gave a preppy Karen just enough room to shove and cut in line in front of me. Before she could retreat from the wall of stink, I quickly stepped forward, trapping her between me and the homeless guy. She tried to retreat to get away from him, but I just turned 3/4 and braced myself. I wasn't moving. The guy was wasted and fumbling to count out the nickels, dimes, and pennies for his beer. We locked eyes, stink eye if you will, and she knew exactly what I was doing. It took forever for the guy to check out, and Karen had to endure. I'm guessing she had to wash her clothes when she got home as they were permeated with his odor. I smiled all the way home. Say it with me, nobody likes a line cutter. I think this seems just about right as a punishment for being a filthy line cutter. And our final story of the day is by an anonymous poster. Too busy to replace a drink? You're about to be a lot less busy. This happened a while ago, but was reminded of it recently. My then fiance, female, and I, male, were at the movies ordering drinks. She's a type 1 diabetic, so she needs to have a sugar-free drink. And I don't like the taste of diet stuff, so I get full sugar drinks. Ordered drinks, and when the server put them down in front of us, we asked which one was which. He shrugged, and then when I kept staring at him expectantly, pointed at one and told me he thought that one. I grabbed a couple of straws and took a sip of each, and they tasted exactly the same. I asked if he even gave us a sugar-free one, and he didn't answer. I passed one of the drinks back and asked that he replace it with a sugar-free. He refused immediately and said once it was poured, he couldn't swap it. I explained the diabetes issue and told him I knew for a fact he could change the drink if a customer wasn't happy. He argued this wasn't the case and he'd be sacked if he swapped it, which I was flabbergasted by, firstly because he was lying, and secondly because I'd just explained this was a medical issue. And then half shouted that it was really busy and that he didn't have time to change it. We'd already held up the queue enough. I stared at him silently for a moment, then asked, "You're new here, aren't you?" Silence from him. I then said, "I'm OP. I'm one of the supervisors here," while handing him my employee discount card. "I'm off work this week, so we haven't met yet. Replace the drinks so we can go and see our film, and we'll discuss this another time." Dude was as white as a sheet, but got a new drink. A few days later, he's in a disciplinary meeting for failing to follow policies and giving poor customer service. Usually that would have resulted in a warning, but trying to force a customer to take a drink that could theoretically put her in a coma upped it to him getting fired. Not only that, but the reason he got a job there in the first place was that his girlfriend worked there and put in a good word for him. His behavior, both the incident itself, she was pissed that she now looked bad for recommending him, and the way he apparently whined about it for weeks afterwards and tried to find a way to sue the cinema instead of looking for a new job led to her dumping his butt. So the guy went from being too busy to pour a drink to having no job and no relationship. Guessing he had a lot more free time on his hands after that. Imagine being in any restaurant type job. Getting the customer the wrong item or not caring enough to get them the right item specifically to begin with, then them saying, "I have a medical condition, I need this specific type." And your answer is, "Sorry, it's too busy?" Not to mention the fact that the cheapest thing in any restaurant is going to be the drink machine. It costs them next to nothing for the drinks. That's like absolutely the most replaceable thing in the entire house. And it takes all of 30 seconds to go change out a drink too. It's kind of just mind-boggling. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. So of all these stories I've read today, which is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't yet, if you could like and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. Whatever you do, whether it's liking, subscribing, turning notifications on, all of it helps grow this channel, and I appreciate the heck out of it. So until next time, I'll see you all tomorrow with some more stories.